All right, that is U.S. President Donald Trump, in the Rose Garden just outside the White House, making his long-promised announcement on what he terms reciprocal tariffs on what he has also called Liberation Day. I'm going to be super straightforward with you. It is not entirely clear what this means for Canada. And I say that for a couple of reasons. And I promise you we are efforting behind the scenes to figure it out exactly what it does mean for Canada. But he provided a big list of countries which he says, which the United States will impose reciprocal tariffs on. They range from China to South Africa to Israel, like you name it, basically all the countries around the world. Not on the list that he produced either on stage or that the White House is producing behind the scenes is either Canada or Mexico. Now, at the same time, Donald Trump, beyond the reciprocal tariffs, which he says are about worth half of what the other country is tariffing or putting any kind of non-tariff barriers in place. Again, this is his calculation. In addition to all that, he also says there will be a 10% global tariff. Again, we are efforting to figure out, you would assume that would apply to Canada, but even on the list that have been produced by the White House, they have enumerated a number of countries. You probably can't see here. We'll put them up on a graphic. But they have enumerated a number of countries which will see just 10% as a tariff. And again, Canada and Mexico are not on that list. Now, like I said, we've reached out to the White House. Their response initially was just to produce all these graphs for us again, which don't include Canada and Mexico. We've gone back and we've asked, is Canada exempt from any reciprocal tariffs, or is there some sort of other arrangement? Or, for example, are we also subject to that additional 10% tariff? Because it simply isn't clear. The president only named Canada, I believe it's once, when he talked about what, again, he would view as tariffs on American dairy. Just to sort of contextualize what he said, he talked about, and he said this many times, 200 to 300% tariffs. That's not, in fact, the case. It's above a certain quota that those tariffs would be imposed. And that quota isn't anywhere close to being met. On an annual basis, it's about half of that. I'm being told that Ontario's Premier Doug Ford is reacting, I believe live at the moment. We'll swing over to that to take a listen in.
If that's what it is, if we take the president, and 25% or whatever the carve-out is for autos, 25% on parts or the whole thing, that's still absolutely devastating for this province's economy, isn't it?
If it was 25% and 10% on top of that, yes. But we don't believe that's the situation.
Last question.
When it comes to the auto manufacturing sector, so there are 25% tariffs coming on autos. Is it your understanding that that's going to have a huge impact on the automakers in Canada? You said you were going to have a conversation with those CEOs.
Well, we did have a conversation with the CEOs. I believe and hope, this isn't written in stone, but I believe it's going to be a lot less than 25%. And that's what I believe through our conversations.
Thank you. Thank you. That was the last question.
It was related to the dairy, talking about 200% plus. I know you tried to fact check that this morning in one of your interviews.
Yeah, well, that's not accurate because the last deal, and it was under President Trump that made that deal, anything over their quota, then they get tariffed. They have not met the quota on dairy as of yet. So that doesn't exist. They've never been tariffed on dairy.
Are you expecting
that was the last question. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll be reaching out to them. I just want to remind everyone, this goes through the federal government. We're in close communication with Minister LeBlanc, along with the Prime Minister.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
We'll have more to say later.
I apologize.
Did Levin give you a heads up at all today, like you said he would?
No, I spoke to him last week and he wasn't too sure. So let's just see where we go from there, and I'll keep everyone informed. Okay. But thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
That is Ontario Premier Doug Ford reflecting some of the confusion about exactly what has been announced by U.S. President Donald Trump just moments ago in the Rose Garden of the White House. He talked about reciprocal tariffs on the rest of the globe, but did not name Canada or Mexico. He's also talking about a global 10% tariff, which brings us straight to another special edition of Power Play. We're going to reset things here. Donald Trump announcing reciprocal tariffs, big numbers on countries like China, Japan, and the EU. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa. We are still efforting to find out what this means for Canada. A couple of things to point out: that the list of tariffs that were, or reciprocal tariffs that were announced by the president, like I said, a wide variety of countries. We're looking at everything from, 34% rather in China to 46% in Vietnam, all over the map. He says basically the calculation that the White House did was, here's what we assess the barriers and the tariffs to be worth in each country, and we're going to do half of that. He said something like, it's because we're such a kind country. We have reached out to the White House to try and figure out what exactly that means for Canada because we're not on that list. I will convey to you some reporting from CNN just coming into our inbox that the policy will also put in place a baseline 10% on tariff on all goods from countries except those compliant with the USMCA free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So there are more indications, including from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who just spoke outside his office, that the tariffs that we had been anticipating today, at least, might not, in some respect, apply to Canada in nearly the way they appear to be applied to the rest of the world, and that also even the auto tariffs, which are coming into effect overnight, Premier Ford talked about how there might be some mitigating factors there as well. We're trying to figure out exactly what he means by that. Here to help us all try and make sense of what we just heard is a special edition of our front bench. We've got Scott Reed here. He's a CTV News political commentator, as well as former communications director to Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin. Former interim Conservative leader Rana Ambrose is with us. She's the deputy chairwoman of TD Securities. And our CTV News political analyst and former leader of the NDP, Tom Mulcair, is here too. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks for listening to that press conference. Maybe that you know something I don't, Scott, but as more information comes in and we're trying to figure out, it seems like we may have certainly escaped the worst of what he plans to do to other countries. I don't know.
Well, let's hope so, but that still leaves us in a very unwelcome position. And look, imagine the position of Premier Ford. Imagine the position of the Prime Minister. Imagine if you're a plant worker wondering whether or not you're going to have a job in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and listening to that carnival of confusion and economic illiteracy. It is absolutely unclear what's going to happen, to whom, when, at what rate. So does this mean we only have a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, or a 35%? Does it mean that we only have a 25% tariff on our auto industry, or is it going to be 35%, or is it going to be something much less than 25%? Who knows? These are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs on the line, people's lives and livelihoods. And, this guy's up there acting like he's running a church bingo, holding up placards and stunts. And, you have to ask yourself, how can you possibly engage with this White House? And now the phone lines are going to be clogged because every single country that's up on his Bristol board there is going to be trying to reach to understand exactly what's the calculation that takes me to 34% if I'm China, or 77%, or whatever the heck it is. So it's a complete soup of confusion, and confusion creates uncertainty, and that creates economic vulnerability.
Yeah, there's definitely no taking the uncertainty away. That I can attest to very much. So, Rana, we're so focused on what this means for Canada, but we're also part of a globally integrated economy to a certain degree. When I look at the possibility of a 34 or 44% tariff on everything China makes that goes into the United States, or another 20% on all of the EU, that in and of itself will have massive consequences.
I think it has a lot more consequences for China and the EU than it does for us today. I think today we have to reflect on what's in front of us. What we heard from Trump is about his tariff plan and his tax cut plan. On the reciprocal tariff front, Canada and Mexico are not included in that, and we have argued for months why we shouldn't be targeted by the U.S. for these unjustified tariffs. And we are not being targeted by reciprocal tariffs, at least not to the extent of other countries. And let's hope that this is some type of justification and understanding and recognition that Canada and the U.S. and Mexico have an integrated economy, and a big part of our economies are already today tariff-free. Interestingly, I found if you read the document, I just perused it really quickly. He talks about Lutnick, he talks about the USMCA not having delivered what it should have delivered to date. And so then invoking the National Security Clause to then start to talk about what he wants to do with the USMCA, which is to apply 25% tariffs on all foreign-owned or foreign-made vehicles. He mentions then Korea, Japan, India. He never mentions Canada or Mexico. But if you read between the lines, what he does say is what he said last week. Inasmuch as if you're compliant with the USMCA and a car is made in Mexico or Canada, they're going to add up how many parts are not American made, and then there might be a tariff applied to those pieces of the car. It's very complicated. I think that's where the uncertainty comes in. How is this really going to affect different cars made in Mexico and Canada with the Mexican and Canadian materials? We don't have clarity on that, but it is falling under this larger, I assume, negotiation tactic around the USMCA. And I found it interesting because that's where we could read clearly where he's coming at us. He's coming at us on autos. And he's saying, I want more parts in the North American made vehicle made by Americans in America. He did this in the last round of negotiations. He wants more now. That's the threat. That's the threat to the auto sector. So what do we do? And then he mentions, which was almost bizarre, he's talking about tariffs on the entire globe. And he picks out supply management and the dairy sector, which people around the world must have watching this speech coming from the Rose Garden thinking, what's with Canada's dairy sector? Why is he targeting this, something we've never heard of? Well, we've all heard of it because the dairy sector and supply management is one of the biggest irritants in every trade negotiation that Canada has embarked on in the last several decades since it's come into being. So we know now he's coming after dairy again, which he came after last time. We managed to increase the amount of dairy exclusion for the United States, and we compensated our dairy farmers. I think it was $2 billion to do that. But obviously he's coming after that again. So I think what Pierre said this morning, we've got to get to the negotiating table. After the election, that has got to be the first thing we do, is sit down with Mexico and the United States and start hammering out what this actually looks like.
Well, therein again, and Tom reminds us, like, there's a federal election going on, right? And referring to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party's comments, which I know maybe, people will say are, there's differences in delivery and in the framing, but ultimately Mark Carney last week also said that this was the start of negotiations, not per se of USMCA, but the idea that clearly Trump is using the tool of tariffs, in his view, to start renegotiating the trade relationship between Canada and the United States. Seems like all federal leaders seem to have that impression at this point. It does largely, to Ronna and Scott's point, there's tons of upheaval around the world based on what's being announced, but I can't help but have the sense like we were expecting something even worse than already exists, and it doesn't seem like that's the case from Canada. There's additional reports out now saying that we will even get an exemption from that baseline 10% tariff based on the presence of USMCA.
Well, how can it be otherwise, Vashi? Because if the whole idea is to renegotiate the USMCA, then they have to show some sign of good faith in applying the deal that Trump signed himself. It's not as if he can say that it's Joe Biden's fault. It's Donald J. Trump who held up the signed copy with Mexico and Canada and saying this had just replaced what he had described as the worst trade deal in the history of the United States, because he never exaggerates on anything, and that was the NAFTA. So it was replaced by this one, and all of a sudden, I'm listening to Lutnick carefully when he says, well, it didn't produce the results we wanted, which is an indication you want to negotiate. But it's also an indication that he's leaving the door open to maybe slipping something in there that would be completely against that trade deal. So if this means that we're heading back to the negotiating table, that's what Carney's been signaling. Francois Legault, to give one provincial premier, is on side. And what's most distressing here is to listen to the premier of the province that produces the most automobiles, Doug Ford, who's been just such a stalwart. He deserves to be recognized for the very positive role he's played. He was standing there in front of the microphones and just simply saying, we don't know. And how is it possible that you get through the 1 hour diatribe in the Rose Garden? I listened to every second of it, as we all did, and saying, but we don't know. And it's the uncertainty that is the basic problem in all of this. You know, everybody looks at Mr. Trump goes on and on about, oh, there's all these companies coming in. There are no deals being made right now. Nobody is deciding. Nobody's board of directors is going to tell them that they can go ahead because there is so much uncertainty. If this is an indication that at least that trading partnership, Canada, U.S., Mexico, is going to be allowed to continue in some form, that's good. But you also have to listen to what Trump says when he talks. He kept referring to kept calling it a VAT. That's the value-added tax, the VAT, which is something that we have, something that Europeans have on a much higher level. He's lumping that in. He says tariffs and these things. So we've got to keep our eye on that, because then that goes right at the heart of our ability to have our own fiscal and revenue system. That's something that was never contemplated. And I think that it's going to be on the table in the next round of negotiations.
The list of things to keep our eyes on is a mile long at this point. Thank you all for listening to that press conference with us and your analysis this evening. I appreciate it. Scott Reed, Rana Ambrose, and Tom Mulcair. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We have more coverage just ahead of this announcement of reciprocal tariffs from the White House. U.S. President Donald Trump appears to have largely exempted Canada, though very few other countries around the world will have the same luck. What does it mean for our economy? What should we keep an eye on? And also, we're expecting some reaction from Parliament Hill. All of that is ahead on Power Play. We're back in just a moment. All right, that is U.S. President Donald Trump, in the Rose Garden just outside the White House, making his long-promised announcement on what he terms reciprocal tariffs on what he has also called Liberation Day. I'm going to be super straightforward with you. It is not entirely clear what this means for Canada. And I say that for a couple of reasons. And I promise you we are efforting behind the scenes to figure it out exactly what it does mean for Canada. But he provided a big list of countries which he says, which the United States will impose reciprocal tariffs on. They range from China to South Africa to Israel, like you name it, basically all the countries around the world. Not on the list that he produced either on stage or that the White House is producing behind the scenes is either Canada or Mexico. Now, at the same time, Donald Trump, beyond the reciprocal tariffs, which he says are about worth half of what the other country is tariffing or putting any kind of non-tariff barriers in place. Again, this is his calculation. In addition to all that, he also says there will be a 10% global tariff. Again, we are efforting to figure out, you would assume that would apply to Canada, but even on the list that have been produced by the White House, they have enumerated a number of countries. You probably can't see here. We'll put them up on a graphic. But they have enumerated a number of countries which will see just 10% as a tariff. And again, Canada and Mexico are not on that list. Now, like I said, we've reached out to the White House. Their response initially was just to produce all these graphs for us again, which don't include Canada and Mexico. We've gone back and we've asked, is Canada exempt from any reciprocal tariffs, or is there some sort of other arrangement? Or, for example, are we also subject to that additional 10% tariff? Because it simply isn't clear. The president only named Canada, I believe it's once, when he talked about what, again, he would view as tariffs on American dairy. Just to sort of contextualize what he said, he talked about, and he said this many times, 200 to 300% tariffs. That's not, in fact, the case. It's above a certain quota that those tariffs would be imposed. And that quota isn't anywhere close to being met. On an annual basis, it's about half of that. I'm being told that Ontario's Premier Doug Ford is reacting, I believe live at the moment. We'll swing over to that to take a listen in.
If that's what it is, if we take the president, and 25% or whatever the carve-out is for all.
Starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating. And because we are being very kind, we're kind people, very kind, we will charge them approximately half of what they are and have been charging us. So the tariffs will be not a full reciprocal. I could have done that, yes, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries who didn't want to do that.
U.S. President Donald Trump just minutes ago from just outside the White House in the Rose Garden there announcing his long-promised reciprocal tariffs on what he termed Liberation Day. And there are a lot of tariffs that apply to many other countries around the world. But Canada at this point looks to be largely emerging unscathed. And I say that because we are not on the lists that the White House produced of other countries and what the tariff that they would be subjected to. Neither is Mexico. And there are multiple reports at this hour, and we are efforting to confirm it ourselves at the White House, that even a 10% baseline tariff that Donald Trump announced tonight, reciprocal in nature, as he characterized it, would not apply to goods that are covered by the new NAFTA or the USMCA as it's being termed, which would largely, mean that much of what we trade with the United States would not be subject to that 10% tariff. To try and figure out the overall economic impact of what we just heard and sort of look ahead to what might come, Stephen Pawlaz is back with me. He's a former Bank of Canada governor and current special advisor at Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Hello again. Thank you for listening to all of that and trying to help us make sense of it. Are you at all as surprised as maybe I felt? I think we were bracing for what appeared to be much worse. It doesn't sound like the worst case scenario, at least for Canada.
At least for Canada. What I appreciate is that there seems to be a degree of respect for USMCA. Been ignored throughout the 25% on steel, aluminum, and of course autos, which was reinforced again today. But the rest, for that comment we received from the Prime Minister after his phone call, which is, yes, after the election, whoever is in government, there would be a fulsome conversation, a negotiation around not just trade, but our security arrangements with the United States, a whole new package. And that seems to have been the substance of that conversation. So this leaves it there in that, someday in the future. But getting back to what it means for the world.
Yeah, I did want to ask you because
sure.
those are some hugely significant
They're
tariffs
really
on the EU, on
there.
China, on Japan, on Taiwan. My goodness.
Yeah, so, this is truly a big stagflationary shock for the world.
And what does that mean in
Well,
layman's terms?
we always said it would be stagflationary. That means it would raise prices, inflation probably, at the same time as it slowed economic growth. That's, from the 1970s, the term stagflation. And in some countries that were harder hit, you might expect more stag than inflation, such as Canada, a very trade-dependent country. Whereas maybe our inflationary parts would come mostly from whatever retaliatory tariffs that we use. Whereas in the U.S., it would be mostly inflation and maybe not much stag. But even already, the investment and housing and so on have already slowed quite significantly in the United States. So there's even talk about recession indicators flashing red in the United States already. So perhaps the president won't be satisfied with his initiative until he has created the greatest recession ever, or something like that from a global standpoint. During his presentation, he talked about how tariffs were in place after, up to World War I. And then we invented the income tax. And he suggested that that's where the Great Depression came from. And they tried to put tariffs back in place during the early part of the Great Depression, but it was too late to avoid the Great Depression. Such an inversion of economic history. I've never seen anything like it.
Fact check it if you could.
I guess.
And when it comes to, the other indication that he clearly made tonight that he has previously is the view that, when he talked about, for example, income tax, that he doesn't think that should be the means of raising revenue, that these tariffs will be a means of raising revenue. But my goodness, at what cost?
Well, they really will. Even if they get negotiated down or there's responses from various countries to, in effect, invert reciprocity, I guess the word I want, maybe lower some of their tariff barriers, and that would maybe give a lower tariff in the United States. Perhaps that's the kind of process that would be envisioned. But even so, in the end, there will be a lot of revenue coming from some of these tariffs. And ask what would be the response. Let's say, if you've bought a Barbie doll for one of your kids, I just looked on Amazon. I wasn't sure how much they cost. They cost $12, $15, $20. Is China then going to reshore Barbie doll production to the United States? instead of making them in China and shipping them? I don't think so. And a 34% tariff, I think it was, for China would make a Barbie doll $15 or $16 or $25 for the deluxe one. I don't think it's going to change anything, except to cause inflation in the United States.
And what do you think the chances, and I obviously know that there's a lot of mitigating factors, but what are the chances are a recession does hit the United States?
Well, I'd say they're pretty high because that's, it's literally not inflation is when prices go up if the economy is slowing down. And what it does is it contracts the amount of spending power that consumers have. Mm-hmm. And they've already been working through a very tough cost of living shock from the post-pandemic period. So I think this will only reinforce that feeling of angst down in the bottom part of the U.S. economy. The so-called waves of investment that will come to the United States, I understand all that, but that is not going to change the consumer, right away. We may have to go through a U.S. recession, and of course, many countries, perhaps the world, will have a recession.
And what about Canada, given how interdependent we remain, despite all of the conversations we're having?
Well,
otherwise?
it's too early to make calls like that, but I would say probably. It would be hard to avoid if there is a global recession. Mm-hmm. But I think if we focus on finding ways to make it appropriate for companies to invest to the future in this slowdown period instead of waiting out, then we have a chance of creating a buffer on that downside.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much, Mr. Paulos. Appreciate it very much.
Pleasure.
Stephen Paulos was the governor of the Bank of Canada. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We have lots more coverage of this announcement from the White House and what it means for Canada ahead, plus reaction from Parliament Hill. We do expect in about 20 minutes to half an hour time to hear from the Prime Minister as well. Back in a moment with that.
We will establish a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. You notice that on the chart. And that'll be on other countries to help rebuild our economy and to prevent cheating. So we're going to have a minimum of cheating, and we're going to be very severe on the people that at the gate that watch the tariffs and watch the product coming in, because there's been a lot of bad things happening at the gate.
So where we stand right now, it's honestly, it's pretty unclear. I know as much as what you know, listening to President Trump right now. The positive thing that I saw was we weren't on that list. We weren't on page 1, we weren't on page 2, we weren't on page 3, and ourselves and Mexico. So we're going to stay tuned. Let's hope that there's some positive news coming.
That is reaction from Ontario Premier Doug Ford just a number of minutes ago to the announcement last hour from U.S. President Donald Trump on his so-called Liberation Day. He announced reciprocal tariffs for a majority of countries the United States deals with. And we didn't see on that initial list Canada or Mexico, of course, both countries covered by the trilateral free trade agreement at the moment between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. We are just receiving into our inbox. I had mentioned earlier we were efforting to find out from the White House if we can take from that these new tariffs, including a global 10% reciprocal tariff, would not apply to Canada. And in fact, it seems that is the case, that Canada has escaped today's application of new reciprocal tariffs or a 10% blanket across the board tariff, and that instead, what we know, yes, auto tariffs come into effect on foreign-made cars, 25%. That is something that Trump signed with an executive order exactly a week ago. But even the tariffs that are tied to fentanyl and the border, the document from the White House, which they term a fact sheet that they just shared with us, essentially outlines that the sort of exemption for goods that are compliant with the USMCA. So that is basically nearly all of what was initially slapped with the tariff. That exemption, which was set to expire this week as well, will now remain in effect. So, it doesn't say exactly till when, but it says basically it will remain in effect. So my understanding at this point is that there are no new additional tariffs on goods coming from Canada to the United States, except for the tariffs that are already applying to steel and aluminum, and then the ones that are coming into effect on autos. As you heard from Premier Ford, even around those tariffs, though, there is a lack of clarity. There are conversations apparently taking place right now about what the USMCA might mean in the application of those tariffs. So we will stay tuned tonight as we wait to hear from the federal government, in particular Prime Minister Mark Carney, who between now and when federal cabinet starts in the next half an hour will make some comments, initial comments at least, to reporters, and we'll carry that live for you. To get some more perspective on the implications of what I just shared with you, I'm joined live now by Derek Burney. He was Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, as well as our ambassador to the United States from 1989 to 1993. Mr. Burney, good to see you as always. Your initial reaction to, I mean, there's two separate things going on here. One, how it applies to Canada. Two, the fact that he announced these massive tariffs on the rest of the globe. On the first part, what does that tell you about sort of how much of this is going to be tied to a renegotiation of USMCA?
Well, I hate to say I take Trump at his word, because I don't. But I think the prospect of a negotiation that he signaled in his conversation with our prime minister, we should at least attempt to achieve. And we should, I guess, celebrate small mercies from the announcement he made today, if in fact what your fact sheet from the White House proves to be true. I still am a little bit suspicious about non-tariff barriers, what he called non-monetary barriers. So I would want to see the details before I know exactly how immune we are, because really this was a signal to a return to the law of the jungle in terms of world trade. He called it Liberation Day. I think he could have called it Demolition Day, because we now know that the United States has no regard for the World Trade Organization or its principles. And it's the law of the jungle, and you've got a Republican elephant who is the king of the jungle, no longer a lion, but it's an elephant, and it's a Republican elephant. It was an entirely America First speech, and I think that the consequences, he masked the negatives about the tariffs by, as your previous guest said, completely inverting the history of tariffs in the United States in relation to the Great Depression. But my goodness, I don't know how the world is going to absorb this kind of shock without, he tried to mask what the pain is going to be, even for Americans, with the emphasis on the $6 trillion of investment that he's, more than $6 trillion, from both foreign and domestic companies that he's attracted in 100 days. Now, actually, that's a staggering figure, and that may have more of a consequence for Canada than the impact of tariffs, because we're in no position in terms of our tax, regulatory, and other policy positions today to compete effectively with a country that's going to inject that amount of investment in its capabilities. And if there's a message for Canada, we have to be very strict and disciplined in handling the tariffs, by all means. But the more important message, in my opinion, for the country is that we have to completely overhaul our economic growth policies, taxes, regulatory, the whole shebang. We have to develop our resources, which is our strength, to the maximum extent possible, so we can open new channels for our exports, and we can continue to survive as an economy in which is going to be a very rough world economy.
Mr. Burney, when you talk about the sort of reorienting of global trade relationships based on what Mr. Trump announced today, how do you anticipate that reorients the relationship, like, among those who are being targeted? And by that I mean, like, is there perhaps any strength in numbers and the response that might come from all of these countries which are being targeted, which is basically without exception?
Well, I think that the two that we should keep our eye on are the European Union, which is being hit with, I think, 34% across the board tariff, and also our Trans-Pacific partners. I mean, we have better strength if we're working in conjunction with our partners in trade agreements that, of course, Mr. Trump denigrates totally. I mean, he refuses to even consider joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was interesting to see just in the last week, Vashi, that Japan and Korea had a meeting with China in order to strengthen their economic relations. They could see what was coming. Well, we're going to have to do the same. We have to have a more open door attitude regarding China. We have to repair our relationship with India. We have to concentrate on the Trans-Pacific partners for expansion, as well as on the European Union. We haven't really taken full advantage of the agreement we have with the European Union. There's a lot of scope there, but I can't stress enough to you that the more important aspect for our government is its domestic policy. Domestic policy. We have no chance of being competitive in a tougher trade world if we continue the way we have during the past decade.
Well, if there's any good news, the good news is that that very question you raised has certainly been the focus of this election campaign so far. And I imagine, given everything that's going on with Donald Trump, will remain the case over the next 3 weeks. Mr. Bernie, thank you very much for sharing your time with us this evening. I appreciate it.
Most welcome.
Thank you. Former ambassador to the United States, Derek Burney there. Let's do the converse now and talk to a former U.S. ambassador to this country, David Cohen. He was Joe Biden's ambassador here in Ottawa for a number of years until just a few months ago. Mr. Cohen, it's a pleasure. Ambassador Cohen, a pleasure to see you again, as always. I wanted to start off with the big picture with you, this sort of idea of Donald Trump standing in the Rose Garden talking. I know in Canada we're all saying, oh, wow, we escaped this one round. But my goodness, every other country, and as our last guest pointed out, China and the European Union, like those are not small tariffs at all. Your impression that you could convey to us about how this is going over in the United States and the wider impact of this announcement?
Well, as I was thinking about what I was going to say before coming on here, before the announcement, one of the things I was going to say was that everybody should be a little cautious. This is complicated stuff, and it's going to take a while to sort out exactly what's going on. And listening to your newscast, you and your guests have been doing exactly that, which I think is important because it's going to take a while to figure out what's happening here, but the Rose Garden announcement, the charts that are prepared, Donald Trump has a vision to remake the international global trade order in a way that has never been done before. And you've heard me say in the months leading up to this that Canada shouldn't be too defensive. Yep, they're a target of President Trump, but he's got a much broader target, and that in fact, the issues of trade and of security and of defense go way beyond Canada and Mexico. And I think that's what you saw in this announcement, the ambition of President Trump to remake the trade order in a way that he believes will benefit the United States. Sorting through whether that's the case is going to take time. I heard one economist this morning say that if you were to line up 1,000 smartest economists in the world and ask them their opinion on what a broad-based tariff increase would do, whether it would be good or bad for the United States economy and for the economy, 998 of them would say that it would result in an increase in prices, increase in inflation, lower economic growth, and that those are the only certain results of across-the-board tariff increases. But there are economists who have a different opinion, and certainly Donald Trump has a different opinion, and it's going to take a while to sort through that. In terms of the reactions in the United States, I've been really waiting to go on the air with you, listening to the announcement like everyone else has. I haven't heard many announcements. I can give you objective data, which is that in the first hour of Donald Trump's speech, the Standard & Poor's futures dropped 2.2%. So initial reaction, the stock market isn't open. I think it's not accidental that this announcement was scheduled for after the closing of the stock market. But when you look at the futures of the stock market, the initial reaction of the United States to this announcement is not positive.
Let me follow up with you on that, because you mentioned the 998 economists. My gut tells me that Donald Trump doesn't care what those economists say, but he might care if Americans writ large start to find their life inordinately more expensive. Do you have a sense that will ultimately exert some pressure or some pushback on the imperative that he has spelled out today, and the sort of reasoning he is outlining for these tariffs, the rationale, as you put it?
I think that is the only thing that will result in moderation of President Trump's ambition. And it's not just the stock market. It is not just grassroots. It is when senators and congressmen go back to their districts. We've already seen multiple canceled town hall meetings. It's the pressure that they feel, which when they come back to Washington is pressure that they will put on the White House and on the president. And if in fact those economists are right, and we're going to see fairly quickly increases in prices, and it's increases in prices on things people care about: groceries, automobiles, right, housing. I mean, this is what motivates people. Inflation, if there's one thing Donald Trump knows, it is that the American voting public is scared of inflation and hates inflation and votes on increased inflation, because arguably Donald Trump got elected on that emotion, on the fear and the dislike of the American voting public for inflation. And if the short run results over the next few weeks, over the next few months, are increases in prices, increases in inflation, continued reductions in the stock market, which, remember, the stock market is not just for rich people. People's retirement accounts and their 401ks are disproportionately in the stock markets. And if people see their retirement accounts dropping, the amount they'll be paid on retirement dropping, if they see the prices they're paying in the supermarkets going up, and if important industries to the United States and to the president, like agriculture, see greater problems as a result of a trade war, that is the type of activity that will create pressure for at least moderation of these incredible global trade ambitions that the president clearly has.
Ambassador Cohen, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate your analysis tonight. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me on. And my last word of advice, I gave two pieces of advice. One is to Canada, which is the reactions I heard from Premier Ford, reactions I heard from you are the right reactions. Take a breath. Let's figure out what's going on here. I'll give you another concrete piece of advice, which I've given, which is Canada's talked about, has talked about retaliatory tariffs in reaction to what Donald Trump is doing. Now, there may not be the need for any of those, depending on what we learn has actually been done. But take a page from Donald Trump's playbook, which is don't call them retaliatory tariffs. They're not retaliatory tariffs. That sounds like it sounds like a personal agenda. They are reciprocal tariffs. I mean, Donald Trump is a great communicator. So these 40 countries that are on that chart that have these generous reciprocal tariffs of about half of what they're charging the United States, those aren't retaliatory. They are reciprocal to make up for what those countries are doing to the United States. That's the way Canada should be talking about whatever it is that it chooses to do. So I just leave you with that advice.
Okay, I will take that advice. Thank you so much, Ambassador Cohen. Appreciate it. David Cohen was the United States ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to this country under former President Joe Biden. A lot more coverage coming up of Donald Trump's announcement from the White House on reciprocal tariffs. Canada looks at this point, and we do say so, as our guests have mentioned, very cautiously, but it looks, at least from the facts that the White House is providing, that we have escaped the application of this new round of reciprocal tariffs. Other tariffs do remain in place. We await a comment from Prime Minister Mark Carney. There's a meeting of premiers tomorrow, and Cabinet is meeting as we speak. We'll be back with more reaction after a short break.
Tariffs give our country protection against those that would do us economic harm. And many people were looking to do us economic harm. Maybe not so obviously, but they were doing tremendous economic harm. But even more importantly, they will give us growth. These tariffs are going to give us growth like you haven't seen before. And it'll be something very special to watch.
U.S. President Donald Trump last hour from the Rose Garden in the White House, or just outside the White House, announcing a slew of new tariffs, reciprocal in nature, as he characterized it, on what he has also called Liberation Day, on a slew of different countries around the world: China, the EU, Japan, Taiwan, you name it, and very big tariffs in some cases. 34%, 40%, 20%. And then he also talked about a 10% blanket reciprocal tariff across the board. Now, here is what I can tell you about what that means for Canada. And this is according to a fact sheet delivered just moments ago into our inbox from the White House. Essentially, none of it applies to Canada, or to goods more specifically that are covered by what's known as the USMCA. So that's the new NAFTA, the trilateral free trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. That is most of what we trade with the United States. There were also some exemptions for those kinds of goods under other tariffs tied to fentanyl and the border. Those exemptions, my understanding is, continue as well. What does come into effect today that is new is the auto tariff, so 25% tariff on foreign-made autos. And then, of course, there are the 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel, which came into effect a number of weeks ago, which remain in effect. But the big news today appears to be this new round of tariffs, which so many other countries are subject to, does not appear to apply, at least as we understand it from the White House, to Canada. I've got a special edition of the Front Bench here to talk about what that means as we await comment from Prime Minister Mark Carney on Parliament Hill. Sharon Carr is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. She's now a partner at Sovereign Advisory and advising, we like to disclose, the Liberal campaign. Jamie Ellerton is a Conservative strategist and the founder and principal of Canaptas. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Bélanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And Hannah Thibodeau, a former news anchor, is now an executive communications officer at Global Public Affairs. And she rounds us out this evening. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. Sharon was texting me during that press conference saying, like, how do I make sense of this? Because it was an hour, Hannah, as we await comment from the Prime Minister, where we had all been anticipating how much worse is this going to get from Canada. The papers went up. We're looking, they're covered by the podium. And then eventually we look and we see that Canada isn't on that list. What do you think is going on?
Okay, he calls it Liberation Day. I call this Aggravation Day, because we did the same thing. I'm sitting in my office and I'm putting my glasses on and running up to the monitor to see where is Canada on this list. I did not see Canada on this list. That is the good news, the fact that there are no new tariffs on Canada, because it really is making everybody anxious. I feel it in the hair on my arms when these discussions are happening. But if you listen to what Stephen Poloz was telling you, and I was chatting with him out back ahead of time, I came in, it's like, I was talking to Carl too, here's the good news, we didn't get any new tariffs. Yeah. And then we see him talking to you, it's like, expect a recession.
A global recession, which is not something small in nature.
A global recession. And this is what Donald Trump is single-handedly doing. What I really want to know, and I bet you everybody on this panel too, is what was that conversation between Liberal leader, Prime Minister at the time when he made the call with President Donald Trump to, that we don't have these new tariffs on us? How did he have that conversation? What was it like? Wouldn't you have liked to have known how he had a conversation with this man to change him from saying you're the 51st state, you are a governor, and now sort of skate this way?
The interesting thing is, Carl, when you kind of look back in retrospect, though, there have been indications along the way that this was about the USMCA. And clearly by delaying the fentanyl tariffs by saying, well, goods covered by the USMCA are exempt, that's one. Then if you listen to Mark Carney after that call, he indicated this is the beginning of a negotiation. Even Pierre Poilievre this morning said first thing that should happen is a renegotiation of USMCA. So in retrospect, it feels like it led us to this point. But ultimately, as Hannah said, I think everybody was still bracing for much worse today.
Yeah, and so we're not on the list. Us and Russia. Make of that what you make.
And Mexico, come on.
Mexico is not there. But the point is that everybody's going to hurt. No matter what, because you look at the list, you look at the tariffs that are coming in. He calls them reciprocal. Well, I mean, the numbers don't even match his grievances. There are grievance tariffs, and how do you negotiate yourself out of that? That's the issue with all these countries, and some of them are territories of other countries, and it's going to be a problem. And the market, the future is already way down since the announcement. So what's going to be interesting to me is how the Congress will react. And there's a debate right now in the Senate, and already Republican senators are lining up. Senator
They're finally starting to talk.
About time, right?
Yeah.
Senator Collins from Maine, Senator Murkowski from Alaska. Rand Paul was leading the debate, and he was ripping the policy apart. So we'll have to see how it goes. Mitch McConnell is rumored to be voting with the Democrats on that.
I have read that as well, yeah.
So there's some hope there that the Republicans will not line up behind Donald Trump, but in the past, we've had that hope too, and Republicans ended up lining up behind Trump. So we'll see how it unfolds.
Can we take that live shot just outside cabinet doors? Because most of cabinet, my understanding is, has actually made their way in. They are going to be meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, who we do anticipate will stop to make some general comments in response to what happened with Donald Trump. Our understanding is there were a number of people in and around his circle who were kind of huddled together trying to figure out if, in fact, Canada has dodged these tariffs and what exactly it means for us. We are anticipating tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern, the Prime Minister will also meet with premiers from across the country, and we await reaction from those premiers after that meeting. We had thought the discussion would be, Jamie, about what counter tariffs would come into effect, what is Canada's next move. My guess is that there will be a lot of holding our fire at this moment in time, at least.
I think that's fine, Vashi. I think when you look at essentially, it appears the carve out we've got, and the president, notwithstanding all the blustery rhetoric, is standing behind the trade deal that he signed in his first term, USMCA, CUSMA, NAFTA, whatever we want to call it. I think when you also listen to what's been driving this, I think the president has tipped his hand. We know that the big three automakers got in his ear back in January and got a reprieve on a lot of this then. He had some auto workers and other union workers with him at the White House today, throwing his MAGA hat into the crowd. So this is very much about jobs and manufacturing. And if anyone is talking to the president about what the impact of the worst case scenario, what he was going to do, it was going to put a lot of those very people out of work very fast by effectively shutting down the North American economy overnight. And so I think that's also tipping his hand as to where he's going. And so I think the point for Canada now is, how do we renegotiate a continental trade agreement? How do we work with the Mexicans to make a compelling case? And how do we break down those interprovincial trade barriers? And what's actually going to be our negotiating line? What is on the table? Where are we going to give more market access to the Americans? We know supply management comes up every time. Every single federal leader is saying they're going to stand by it. And so what is it we're actually going to give the Americans what they want? I don't think buying a few more icebreakers for the Arctic is going to be enough to satisfy what the White House is going for here. And leaders are going to have a really honest conversation as to what it's going to be. It can't just be hope and bluster and talking about how we're going to fight for Canada and put on reciprocal tariffs, which effectively, again, is what all the leaders are saying. Concretely, what are we going to do? And so while maybe the A team, the top tier senior cabinet, is going to have to be engaged in very serious, now drawn out negotiations, the rest of cabinet is going to actually have to get on with governing and actually getting rid of some of these things, actually delivering on commitments and improving and getting our own house in order so that we can start to realize our economic potential and get government out of the way where it's currently impeding that success. And I think the kind of top-down leader-driven politics, although leadership is crucial, ultimately we need all elected officials who are, especially those served in cabinet, actually running their departments and not just waiting for a bureaucrat to tell them what to do and what to post to Instagram.
We want to post to Instagram. I feel like, to be fair, people are talking a lot about this, not necessarily posting as much. Sharon, I want to swing over to you. Mark Carney is now anticipated to come out in about 20 minutes' time. As he heads into cabinet, the Prime Minister will offer comments at that point. Sharon, your thoughts on what we might hear?
honestly, there's a lot. There's so much to take away from this, but I know we were listening and trying to figure out where we came to this. And I think what we're going to hear from the Prime Minister as he goes in or out of cabinet is that as much as there might still be a lot of uncertainty out there, we have some sort of path forward in working with the U.S. If you ask everyday regular Canadians what just happened in that press conference, I can assure you they probably have no idea, because it was probably one of the most unhinged things that I've ever watched. But I think the main important point that he has to make, and that everyone needs to understand, is that Trump still is a central threat, not only to Canada, but to the global economy. What he put out on that weird chart with all these numbers on it was basically economic warfare against global countries here. He is calling trade measures tariffs that aren't tariffs. So I don't see how this is going to end well for him. This was a small win for Canada today. I would say that the baseline of it's 10%. But let's not forget how important the auto sector is to Canada. 25% tariffs on Canadian auto industry. And I don't know if the number has changed, but the last time I checked, according to the Auto Manufacturers Parts Association, in addition to S&P Global, have said 25% tariffs means our auto sector is done in 2 weeks at the rate it's going. So this is very consequential. But I think what's a really important thing to remember here is we went from a period of time of being called the 51st state and our prime minister being called the governor, to the temperature being brought down. So I don't mean to be overly partisan about this, but I think we're seeing Mark Carney in his role as prime minister actually succeeding, and now he has to hold Trump to it, because tariffs are for 1 day, Trump is for 4 years.
Okay, I have to take a quick commercial break. Sharon's given us fodder for the continuation of our discussion, which will happen after that break as we stand by to hear comments from Prime Minister Mark Carney in response to the announcement from Donald Trump about reciprocal tariffs, which we understand at this point will not apply to Canada. Back with more of our special coverage after a short break.
We will establish a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. You notice that on the chart? And that'll be on other countries to help rebuild our economy and to prevent cheating. So we're going to have a minimum of cheating, and we're going to be very severe on the people that at the gate that watch the tariffs and watch the product coming in, because there's been a lot of bad things happening at the gate.
So where we stand right now, it's honestly, it's pretty unclear. I know as much as what you know, listening to President Trump right now. The positive thing that I saw was we weren't on that list. We weren't on page 1, we weren't on page 2, we weren't on page 3, and ourselves and Mexico. So we're going to stay tuned. Let's hope that there's some positive news coming.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford reacting to what you heard first from U.S. President Donald Trump, who made that announcement just after 4 o'clock Eastern from the Rose Garden. He had called it Liberation Day, and he spoke of or promised reciprocal tariffs on global trading partners for months. And that is, in fact, what happened this afternoon. Donald Trump announcing reciprocal, as he characterized it, tariffs to the tune of 34% on China, 20% rather on the European Union, 36% on Thailand, 32% on Indonesia. The list goes on and on and on. And a baseline global reciprocal tariff of 10% across the board. Now, fascinatingly, I guess you could say, because it certainly isn't what we had expected, nor were the federal or provincial governments getting this signal. But Canada appears to be, and I say appears because we didn't hear it from the president's mouth, but the White House is circulating documents to this effect. Canada appears to have escaped from the application of the tariffs announced today. There are still tariffs in place for foreign-made autos, but even there appears to be some kind of conversation happening behind the scenes about lessening the impact of those tariffs on Canada. And there is a tariff of 25% on all Canadian aluminum and steel heading into the United States, and that tariff has been in place for a few weeks. As we await comment on the announcement tonight from President Trump by Prime Minister Carney from Parliament Hill, I'm here with the front bench, Sharon Carr, Jamie Allerton, Carl Bélanger, and Hannah Thibodeau. Hannah, I'll start with you again. The auto sector is not something to make light of. I think I'm still I'm like Doug Ford, also confused. Yes, we aren't on page 1, 2, or 3 of tonight's round of tariffs, but those 25% tariffs certainly are consequential if they apply in the way that he's threatened. And then a month from now, they're also supposed to apply to auto parts that aren't manufactured in the U.S.
I really think there's still not a lot of clarity around that. And I feel that because of that it's not clear, there's still some wiggle room in there. And we even heard that Lutnick might be in discussions about this too. So I'm trying to play hopeful here because, we escaped this new round, and then I still feel there might be a bit of hope when it comes to those auto tariffs as well. Because if you hear from the unions representing them, people who work in the shops, that could mean shutdown within 3 days. That is brutal numbers for Canada. And I think it's also going to show that it's not good news for the Americans as well. It'll be interesting to see what Prime Minister Carney, because he's the Prime Minister, he's acting as Prime Minister today after leading the campaign to manage this. It is a big issue. And even if Doug Ford doesn't know what's happening here, how can we decipher what the real rules of the game are? And that's one of the things that a lot of your other guests said. The former ambassador, Derek Burney, we heard from Mr. Polas, it's take a breath before you react to what you think is happening, because you don't really know when it comes to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and we are certainly, I think that's what we're anticipating to hear from the Prime Minister, a more general response, if there are any specifics, for example, to respond to the auto tariffs, if in fact we have some certainty there. That announcement will likely come tomorrow. There will also be a meeting with premiers who are expected to meet at 10 o'clock Eastern tomorrow with the Prime Minister. The ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, just went into that room the doors you're staring at there. That's where cabinet is taking place. When the Prime Minister arrives, he is expected to address reporters and will carry that live. At the moment, I believe the Premier of New Brunswick, Susan Holt, is delivering her reaction to what we heard tonight. We'll take a listen into a bit of that live.
Primary industries will still hurt our country and our economy. Les tarifs sur l'acier et l'aluminium et aussi sur les automobiles, même s'ils ne sont pas les exports primaires
they're
de
not
Nouveau-Brunswick,
the primary exports of New Brunswick, it still hurts our country and our economy.
So the plan that we announced on March 4th remains in place. We are focused on providing support for affected New Brunswickers, support for New Brunswick entrepreneurs and businesses who, even with this current tariff, without the tariffs announced today, the uncertainty has meant an impact to their purchases and to their clients and to their business activities. And so our support program announced remains in place. Notre plan du 4 mars, ça va rester en place. Notre focus sur le soutien pour les travailleurs du Nouveau-Brunswick,
support for the workers of New Brunswick, support for the businesses affected by these tariffs. Even if the tariffs did not change today, we see the uncertainty has stopped purchases, has stopped partnerships, and has a negative impact in non-New Brunswick business. So our plan will remain in place.
Now for businesses who need it. And the team at Opportunities New Brunswick and all of government is ready to support people impacted by this ongoing tariff uncertainty. L'aide est disponible maintenant.
Help is available now.
L'équipe à Opportunité Nouveau-Brunswick et tout le
The
gouvernement
team
est là
at
pour
New
vous
Brunswick
aider.
and the whole government
Si
is
vous
there
êtes
to help
impacté
you
par
if you're
le tarif
impacted
et
by the
l'incertitude,
tariffs and the
de
uncertainty
les activités de l'États-Unis.
of the U.S.
To date, our
activities.
government has undertaken many steps to respond. We have stopped the purchasing of U.S.
That
goods.
is the Premier of New Brunswick talking about her province's response to tariffs more generally. As you heard off the top of her remarks, that there's no new tariffs as it applies to the goods that New Brunswick, at least as she understands it, is sending to the United States. But obviously, some of the other tariffs that have already been announced will have an impact in that province. She referenced a support package that she announced earlier in March and talked about how that will remain in place. We'll keep listening to that, tracking any additional reaction from premiers and share it with you as it becomes available to us. I'm here with the front bench, Hannah Thibedeau, Carl Belanger, Jamie Allerton, and Sharon Carr as we count down to hearing from the federal government, from Mark Carney, the Liberal leader, acting in his capacity in this moment as Prime Minister. I wonder, my understanding is, Jamie, that there won't be specifics announced in any way as he makes his way into cabinet, that there'll be a meeting that follows tomorrow with the premiers. If, in fact, this is all about relaunching negotiations for another version of NAFTA to update the one that Donald Trump actually negotiated himself a number of years ago, what do you think strategically makes sense? Like, is it continuing to hold our fire and not, imposing any new counter tariffs or making public threats? Like, how might that work out, do you think?
Ultimately, this becomes now renegotiating the trade agreement. I think all the comms kind of go through that lens. And on the one hand, I think you're going to hear Prime Minister Carney and other party leaders talk in a kind of similar vein. They're going to give one message to Canadians writ large, hoping to inspire confidence that they have the capabilities to lead the country to this. Two, I think they're going to look at industries and specifically workers who would be most impacted by any and all changes and provide reassurance that they are going to be there to support them through this. And three, of course, if you are actually going to negotiate what this looks like, we need to know what the Americans want. It's not just going to be about supply management. They continue to talk about border security issues and defense spending. And we also know, listening to what the president has to say, that he wants to see more car parts and more auto manufacturing writ large to take place in the United States. So what are the essentially car components? What percentage has to come from where, and where those get drawn up? It will be a huge part of that. And so I think there's going to be very much a wait and see game on the actual substance of what's going on, while the rhetoric will be very big on empathy and trying to provide some reassurance.
I think also, if in fact we do have this now focus point, Sharon, about renegotiation, it also informs the kinds of questions that the leaders will get on the campaign trail over the next 3 weeks. So obviously they have been talking a lot about insulating the country from being this vulnerable going forward. But if you know a renegotiation is on the table, which we kind of had the sense in broad strokes, but if we now know more specifically, I think there are more specific questions that can follow about what you are willing to put on the table or what you would put in front of the U.S. administration during that kind of negotiation.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some tough conversations that need to happen, not only at the federal level, but at the provincial with the premiers around what is it that Donald Trump really wants. Now, in his speech,
good luck, yeah.
whatever we want to call him, whatever he called it, you heard him mention agriculture. He mentioned a lot of stuff about dairy, beef, eggs. By the way, a lot of this was not factual. A lot of it was a bit revisionist in terms of why things are the way they are. So I would guess that supply management is a very big part of what it is he wants to talk about and opening that up. But we've seen here in Canada, there isn't an appetite of that. So we're going to have to really get down to, now that the tone and tenor has gone down from we're going to annex you and make you a governor down to let's talk about what's really bothering us. I think the cards are in Mark Carney's hands because we've seen this shift. And I think everyone has to come to the table willingly. This is no longer just about fentanyl and about the borders. This is about what is with the trade deal that Donald Trump originally signed in his first mandate that he doesn't like, that we want to solve now. And I think if they can do that without being too protectionist, we might see some movement. But honestly, after watching that press conference, there's still going to be a ton of uncertainty. But what we do know is that, again, tariffs are one day. Donald Trump is 4 years. So we need to be thoughtful and mindful of how do we de-escalate for his entire tenure.
4 years might be optimistic even in and of itself, but I'll leave that to another conversation. Hannah,
yeah, I want to jump in there. Here's the thing. We've heard Donald Trump say it was fentanyl. We heard it was the border. We heard it was national security. We now hear it's dairy. We hear it's beef. We hear it's a bazillion different things. Until we know exactly what we are negotiating for and with, I would not start saying, okay, we're going to put more stuff at the border. We're going to do this with fentanyl. Take it seriously because he wants to be taken seriously. But don't start offering up all of these things if you're not really sure that's what he wants, because then you're kind of giving things away without negotiating.
But I mean, it's difficult, Carl, because he's not explicit about it, right? Like, I think, yes, he mentions all these things, but largely he had to invoke the border in order to be able to say this is through presidential decree,
yes, that's right,
and I can sign an executive order. Otherwise, many people don't know this, but actually tariffs are supposed to go through Congress. Remember that thing that was supposed to be a check on the president's power that hardly is at all anymore? I mean, it is so difficult to discern it, that I feel like that's why so much of the focus here, like what he wants, so much of the focus on the campaign has been about like what you do to protect Canada from ever being in this spot again. And what's interesting is right now, Prime Minister Carney doesn't actually need to do anything. Mm-hmm. So politically, it's the best of both worlds because, the focus of the campaign is with Donald Trump and what he's doing right now. And Mark Carney has been looking way better as Prime Minister Carney than as Liberal leader Carney. So for him, this is a kind of a win-win situation. He just needs to show up, perform well, look serious, look confident, not too concerned, certainly not worried, and, deliver reassuring messages. And that's what he will do for the rest of the campaign when these things will flare up, because there will be more. Who knows what side of bed Donald Trump will wake up tomorrow and what's he going to announce in a week. Jamie, what does it mean as we wait for Mark Carney as Prime Minister to offer some comments? What does it mean for the opposition parties, or opposition, at least when there's a government or has been a government, for the Conservatives in your case, for example, in navigating all this?
I think you heard Pierre Poilievre start to talk about that this morning at the speech I was at in Toronto. He's talking about very seriously what he would do and kind of what the reciprocal tariffs would be if they came. It appears we've got it passed today, but I think it speaks to a lot of the other bigger things. We need to make it easier for business to operate in this country. We need to make it easier to get resources that are uniquely locked underground in Canada, can't get them elsewhere, to get those out of the ground and get them to market, whether that's critical minerals, natural gas, or oil. And so there's a lot of other things we can be doing that actually starts to deal with the longer, hard-term economic work that creates more opportunity for this country and positions Canada more in a position of strength. I think when you kind of look at where Canadians are at, and even when you look at the polls, those that are voting on issues specifically like they want to change in affordability, they're very much in the Conservative camp. Those that maybe aren't feeling the economic pain quite as much and see all this uncertainty, right now, according to the polls, they're with Mark Carney and the Liberals. And so I think the challenge for Pierre Poilievre is to how do you continue to make the case for change, but not so much change that it's going to spook people, and demonstrate that you have both the vision, the policy, and I think the next piece that he needs to add to this in the coming weeks, and I think he's still got lots of time to do it in this campaign, is the team. Who's the team going to be working with a Prime Minister Poilievre that can implement this? What skills do they have? How are they going to be tasked? And show that it's not just Pierre Poilievre alone at a podium who's going to be doing this, but there's actually like real change that can deliver to get us away from the past 10 years and everything you did not like about Justin Trudeau, but to an actual better future. I think you heard Pierre Poilievre talk about that on his Flag Day speech back in February. You started to hear more hints of it again today at the speech he gave downtown Toronto this morning, and the ways he can find that not just in speeches, but also in like ongoing photo ops, and to really truly animate that so people feel that over the course of the campaign. If Pierre can bridge that over the next 3 weeks, I think there's a very good chance he's Prime Minister at the end of this campaign.
Let's pull up that live shot outside of cabinet doors, because we were told that Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, has now made his way out of the Prime Minister's office over in Langevin Block and is making his way to Parliament Hill to come up the stairs and deliver some general remarks about what U.S. President Donald Trump announced this afternoon, which was a set of reciprocal tariffs with much of the world, on much of the world, I should say, many of the United States trading partners, from China to the European Union. Mexico and Canada, of course, two partners in a trilateral free trade agreement with the United States, appear at this point to have escaped any new tariffs, including a blanket 10% tariff that Donald Trump says will apply on everyone that the U.S. essentially imports goods from. There are some tariffs that are in place on autos, for example. They come into effect today. Auto parts a month from now. But even tariffs initially a few months ago that applied because of the border, in Donald Trump's characterization, have been suspended, at least insofar as they apply to goods covered by the new NAFTA, which is the bulk of what we trade with the United States. We're standing by to hear from Prime Minister Carney about, I guess, this country's response, but the details of how we respond, my understanding is, won't be announced until tomorrow, after a meeting has taken place between all of the premiers and the Prime Minister. Sharon, you just heard from Carl and Jamie kind of lay out the task ahead for Mark Carney, the task ahead for Pierre Poilievre. Your view on that?
Listen, I think there's a bit of truth to both of them, but to be honest, if we're going to be looking at Pierre Poilievre, we're looking at someone who we already have seen. Someone like Donald Trump has made comments about him not being a nice guy. We are in the position we have been in for the last several months, where he has referred to us as a state, and in a pretty, I would say, disrespectful manner, because he did not like the previous prime minister. And we are seeing that shift. So what we've learned is that Donald Trump respects people who he can somewhat align with and think he can work with. If he thinks that you're either beneath him or whatever the case may be, it actually impacts your entire country. So what we need right now is substance. And I think we're seeing that from someone like Mark Carney. We went from a period where everything was so escalated. And I think it's pretty safe to say that we're not out of the clear. But what is certain is that Mark Carney has helped alleviate the worst of the worst. Seeing what we're seeing today, notwithstanding the 25% on the automobile sector and steel and aluminum, we're seeing a significant decrease in the tension. Now, I don't think anyone should be jumping up with joy, because, again, the auto sector is extremely important here. But I think for someone like Prime Minister Carney, he has proven that he can be taken to the table with someone like Donald Trump. So, again, these tariffs are one-day threats, two-day threats. Every other day it's a new tariff. But Donald Trump is going to be there for 4 years or however long he decides to embed himself in the White House. We need somebody who can talk to him like an adult and de-escalate it. And we've seen that with Mark Carney. So now the Prime Minister is going to have to come out and show confidence to Canadians that there is uncertainty, but that he's got it under control and is working on it. And I don't think Pierre Poilievre brings that to the table.
I do think it's fair to point out, Hannah, that there's been a discernible change in tone in the past week. That is a fair point. I hesitate to, and Sharon did offer some caution, but I hesitate to say problem solved, because I even hesitated tonight to say the White House fact sheet says X, Y, and Z. I don't even know if an hour from now the fact sheet will be delivered to a different email address saying something completely different. It's hard to, as Derek Burney said earlier on the show, you can't really take them at their word, and it's such a fluid situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And Donald Trump has inserted himself directly into our election campaign, whether he wanted to or not. And, you know, when it comes to what Sharon was saying, yes, this seems to, because polls say, benefit the Liberal leader, Mark Carney. But you also see even today, Pierre Poilievre trying to switch that narrative that Donald Trump is not the only story in this election campaign, because Canadians are going to be affected by this. So here's how we're going to try to help Canadians in this type of situation with the Donald Trump presidency over the next 4 years. Will Canadians start to go, oh, yeah, this is the way we want to go now? I don't know, but he still does have time to turn that narrative around. As for Jagmeet Singh, he was asked the other day, how do you even get involved in this conversation? He's trying to do it by talking about workers, trying to breathe some oxygen in it that way, but when it comes to the Liberal and Conservative leader, at this point, it seems like Mark Carney, every time he steps into this role as Prime Minister, he is getting a leg up in the election campaign.
I mean, it's the de facto Doug Ford advantage, Carl, right?
Absolutely.
It was the one that existed for the Premier when he was campaigning during the Ontario election. In the handful of times he acted in that capacity by traveling to Washington or whatever it may be, it just makes it really, and by design,
people can
difficult
visualize
for
them in that role.
other parties.
And it's one of the reasons why Doug Ford went early and ahead of the federal election, because he didn't want to
And
lose.
one of the reasons Mark Carney did too.
Well, absolutely, because if the Israel objective was to solve this crisis, negotiate a new trade deal, we wouldn't be in an election right now. You would have worked out something maybe with the NDP, who were kind of losing track of their support. So maybe you could have done something, but that's not what you decided. So now what we have is a question, a ballot question that is very simple. Who's better positioned to face Donald Trump and stand up to Donald Trump and defend Canada? And there's a flip question, which is, which one is the worst to do that? Which one is the worst position to do that? And the answer to those two questions, depending on where you are either Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. That's a problem for Jagmeet Singh. It's also a problem for the Bloc Québécois, who are losing support in Quebec. And, have you heard of the Green Party lately? They're not part of the conversation either.
If you're just joining us right now, you've got your eyes on the stairs in Parliament Hill in the West Block, where we are anticipating any moment Mark Carney, the leader of the Liberal Party during this federal election campaign, but serving in his capacity as Prime Minister, is scheduled to go into Cabinet, and the door is just on the left-hand side of your screen. So far in that Cabinet room, we know that the lead minister on this file, on these negotiations or discussions with the United States, Dominic LeBlanc, has entered. He had with him Kirsten Hillman, the Canadian ambassador to the United States. A host of other ministers who are involved in this file have also made their way into that room. In any moment now, we do anticipate Mark Carney will stop before entering and deliver some general remarks as far as Canada's more specific response. If there are, for example, other counter tariffs that will be levied on the United States, or if there is a response in some other capacity. We don't anticipate details on that, at least at this juncture, until tomorrow. There is also a meeting after Cabinet tomorrow morning with premiers from across the country who, of course, have a vested interest in whatever Canada's response ends up being. In particular, we've already heard from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who did express some I guess, confusion, like the rest of us, about what exactly this means. In particular, though, we've escaped the reciprocal tariffs or the blanket 10% tariff. An auto tariff, a tariff on foreign-made autos, is also supposed to come into effect of 25%. As the Premier indicated, and as we've heard from other stakeholders this evening, there may be some wiggle room in there for parts of the car or something to the effect of what is covered by the USMCA. We see security coming up now, the Prime Minister's security, so I anticipate the Prime Minister is just a few moments behind those members of his security, and we will, of course, take you there. Let's take a listen in live.
I'll just say a few words.
So, President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians. We're going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force, and that's what we will do. Alors, en français.
So in French, if I may.
Monsieur le Président Trump,
President Trump has just announced a series of measures that will change international trade in a fundamental way. We're doing this here, yeah. He has preserved a few aspects of the U.S.-Canada relationships, very important. At the same time, the unjustified tariffs on steel and aluminum are still in place. And this evening, the tariffs in the auto sector will be implemented. And the U.S. administration has emphasized that there will be tariffs in strategic sectors like lumber, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. Altogether, There will be impacts
Millions de Canadiens.
on millions of Canadians throughout the country.
Nous allons lutter contre
will
ce
fight
tariff. Nous nous battons
these tariffs.
contre les tarifs américains.
We will fight against these U.S. tariffs. We will protect our workers. And we are building the strongest economy in the G7.
Dans une crise, ce qui est important, c'est de
in a crisis, what's important is
d'agir avec de la force.
To act and act with force. And that's the government plan. So today I had a meeting with my council, the U.S. Canada, and there'll be a meeting of the Cabinet U.S. Canada Committee, and tomorrow I'll have a meeting with the premiers, and after all of that, there will be a Canadian response.
Meeting of my Canada-U.S. Council. I will shortly have a meeting. We will have a meeting of the Cabinet Committee, Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee. Tomorrow morning, we will convene First Ministers of the provinces and territories, and we will have more to say after we have taken those soundings. And we'll be back to you shortly.
All right, that is Mark Carney acting in his capacity as Prime Minister, heading into a cabinet meeting up on Parliament Hill. To synthesize what he said there as he made his way in, very general comments in response to U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement earlier today about reciprocal tariffs on much of the globe, but exempting Canada and Mexico from those new tariffs, which include a 10% broad-based tariff on pretty much everybody the United States trades with. Prime Minister Carney talked about auto sector tariffs, which, despite the reprieve from other tariffs, do come into effect later today. That's 25% on foreign-made cars. He also referenced sector-specific tariffs that Donald Trump has threatened on things like lumber, for example, and pharmaceuticals. And he talked about what, in his view, and we've heard from others tonight, would be a significant impact with this announcement. With these reciprocal tariffs on the U.S. economy, the global economy more largely. He said that the tariffs that are in place, which include steel and aluminum and now autos as well, again, despite the fact we seem to have escaped new tariffs today, will affect, he said, directly affect millions of Canadians, and that the federal government intends to fight back with countermeasures. Now, to be clear, the Prime Minister did not detail what those countermeasures are. He is headed into a cabinet meeting, a broad-based cabinet meeting. Tomorrow morning, he says he will meet with the cabinet committee that is focused on Canada-U.S. relations. After that, at 10 o'clock Eastern, the Prime Minister will meet with premiers from across the country, and he says following that meeting, later in the day, he intends to announce the substance and the specifics of Canada's response to the tariffs that are in place as of now. So that will be something significant to watch for, certainly. But the other significant part is what Donald Trump did announce today, which is tariffs that range anywhere from 45% to 34% on China, 20% on the EU. Massive reciprocal, he calls them, tariffs on most of the United States trading partners, which you heard from Stephen Paulos, the former Bank of Canada governor, will likely lead to a global recession, one that Canada is not immune from. We will look to see the fine print of exactly what Donald Trump announced today, but so far the White House has confirmed no new tariffs on Canada and Mexico, thanks to the USMCA, in large part. Now we wait to see what Canada's response to the tariffs that are in place, including on foreign-made autos, and we expect that announcement from Prime Minister Carney tomorrow. I'm going to leave our special coverage there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll turn things over to our Toronto studios. They'll pick things up after a short break with more coverage and more reaction to this big announcement.